Blessed are you, O Lord our God, creator of the universe, for you have wonderfully created us in your image and blessed us with gifts of reason, skill, and imagination. We ask that you stir these gifts up as we take counsel for your church, that in all things your name may be glorified. Amen. Amen. So, the aspect of what we're looking at, yes, re-visioning is certainly part of it. Basically, just transition from moving from one place to another. And that may work smoothly or it may not. Kind of like playing with PowerPoint and finding out, compared to the PowerPoint that I played with 20 years ago, there's all kinds of special transitions you can do on these slides. There's different ways to do it. So today I want to give an introduction at one level, but also give an overview of the topics we're going to cover, just to give you sort of, tell you what we're going to tell you, and then we'll tell you what we told you, type of approach. The aspect about transition is highlighting the aspect that we are always in the process of being and becoming. I think that most of you should recall the name of God given to Moses at the burning bush. I am who I am. And the rabbis tell us that that's, with Hebrew, that can be the present tense, but it can also be the first, the future tense. I am who I will be. I will be who I will be. So we are in the process of becoming all the time, and that's part of what we undergo more transitions than we give ourselves credit for.
Paul, that's also like the song Que Sera Sera.
Yep. Though that does tend to have a more fatalistic aspect and not allow us much room to take part. In San Joaquin, as Bishop David Rice came into San Joaquin, this phrase, called to be, ... It's not called to be dotty, to use the English phrase, to be balmy, Barney, whatever. We're called to be, and that's open-ended. And that's a big question that we all want to be looking at within ourselves as individuals, but collectively as community. Who are we called to be at St. Timothy's? One of the elements that comes to play as we look at transitions is to do a brief overview of what are some of the models of church. Because I think that helps us with our framework. St. Timothy's has been a total ministry congregation. Now, when I was in Nevada, coming from a total ministry congregation, I quickly came to realize that every time I went to another congregation, I had to really listen. They used the word total ministry, but to every one of them, it meant something different. For this church over here, it meant we are all doing this together. For that church over there, it meant we get a free priest. And all of those have some validity, but they're all part of the whole. And so looking at models of church is perhaps helpful. And I think most of us have had experience over the years. The most common model within the church, the rector or a priest in charge. And as that looks at that, the priest presides over the sacramental life of the congregation. That's pretty much what and the pastoral life as well. That's pretty much what the priest was trained for at seminary, if they went to seminary. So they got training specifically toward the sacramental and pastoral life of the congregation. However, in most places, what the priest is hired to do is to oversee the administration of everything. which is not at all what they were trained for.
That's right.
So it's perhaps no wonder that a lot of priests have a hard time in various congregations. That's not what they were trained for. They weren't trained in administration. One of the things about the rector model, and this isn't spoken of very often, the priest is kind of by default the primary discerner of where the Spirit is calling the congregation to be and leads them in new directions. Now this is not paid attention to very much. I first heard of total ministry back in 1978 from Bishop Bill Gordon, who had been the bishop in Alaska at that point for over 30 years and had a lot of congregations that were total ministry. You can imagine, north of the Arctic Circle, where you're snowed in for 6 months at a time, they weren't getting outside priests very well. Yeah. And so the community calling people to be, and I raised the question, okay, now who's listening to the Spirit to help direct? He thought that was heretical to think of the priest as being the one doing this, and yet I maintain to this day that is a function that has to happen within the church community. The question is it being done, and who is doing it, and how are they sharing it? So by default in the past, that's often followed to the rector. Under the canons of the church, that go on for several pages, these are just bullet points highlighting the responsibilities for the rector or the priest in charge. They're responsible for worship. They're to ensure Christian education, especially in scripture and tradition. They're to prepare people for baptism, to prepare for confirmation or reception. In addition, these are other parts of the canon, but I threw them under education, stewardship. To make sure that people understand a good sense of stewardship, not so much to run a fall begathon, but to understand what is stewardship and how do we take care of the gifts that we have. And also responsible for pastoral letters that come out from the House of Bishops or from the bishop. We had a pastoral letter today from Bishop Megan, so that came up through the service. So these are outlined in more detail and more flowery language in the canons. These are the responsibilities. But we also have the aspect of having a vestry led, or the vestry in charge. I never did get to correct the language in Sutter Creek. My former senior warden up there started talking about having a working vestry. And I said, no, the vestry's always been working. You're selling yourself short. It's vestry led. Vestry's in charge.
Right.
And what that means is the vestry attends to the administrative needs, ensures that pastoral needs are being met, ensures that sacraments are being performed, usually by calling a supply priest. Doesn't mean that they have to do all the work themselves. I'm constantly telling people this about the junior warden. People are so scared of being junior warden. It doesn't mean that you have to fix the toilet yourself. It means you have to get it done, however that may be. And so the vestry would take charge of these. In much of the church, the vestry-led congregation is something that only happens for 2 or 3 months every 5 years when they're between priests. It's a different picture when you start looking at having that as a constant model. And at this point, as many congregations are facing harder finances, this is becoming more and more of a situation. As I left Sutter Creek, they could not afford even a quarter-time cleric. And so they were taking these, and once they had talked with the bishop, I said, oh, she was fully supportive, go for it. Boom, they took off and they started making all of this happen. Now, a subset of the vestry-led congregation is the total ministry aspect. And in this case, part of the aspect, the vestry still has administrative oversight, but the pastoral, the teaching, the preaching, and many worship needs are being led by the laity from within the congregation, as opposed to hiring out to have somebody come in. And perhaps you're calling clerics from the congregation to serve that congregation, from within the congregation. Now, I'm going to make the observation from what I understand here at St. Timothy's. One of the challenges, and part of this is just plain human nature, part of the challenge, having the total ministry congregation where the vestry had the oversight, but all of a sudden, inch by inch, they crept into having a priest in charge. So the priest who was called from the congregation, all of a sudden they had the title and the declaration. Our human nature is one we want to say, you're it. You're up, you're in charge. And that changes the dynamic. We love to be able to point to somebody and say, you're in charge. And that means I'm not, and I don't have to do things, or that it changes my responsibility around. But it's something to watch for. And my understanding that at a time, certainly in Nevada was a situation, having a regional vicar, somebody who came around and had a certain amount of oversight, they were here kind of with a certain amount of oversight, but you also had the local priest. So it was shared, everything was shared. The vestry was basically a joke. But all of a sudden, here, now I'm going to set the agenda, so this leads in some ways then into what I'm calling a hybrid model. And that's a lot of what our congregations will be faced with in the future. A lot of this stuff is new. We haven't had some of these financial crises to be looking at some. We still don't know entirely what this looks like. The canon is still having conversations with the bishop. What about? So even as we speak, some of these aspects are in process. So a hybrid model may be that you hire a priest in charge. They're identified as being in charge, but they're there for a limited part-time basis. And the important thing is to understand who has which duties. Oh, we want the priest to be here for 10 hours a week, but we want them to celebrate Mass every Sunday, and we want them to visit the hospital every day, and we want them to, and not only that, we want somebody with 50 years experience who's only 20 years old. So be aware of expectations. Be deliberate about what the expectations are as you have the conversation. What do we want to do? But now let's negotiate what things would look like. So those are the aspects, just a very quick overview of models in terms of what the church is, can be. And I'm going to suggest some of that, keep some of that open in your own minds. I mean, at one level you may say, well, this is who we are, but is that who you're called to be? There may be some modifications as you go forward. What do we want this to look like?
Can I ask a specific question?
Sure.
Is there a way that if you consecrated enough hosts that we could give them out on prayer day? Mary could give out the hosts like they would do in a hospital or any place else, so we could receive communion more than twice a month?
We will need to talk more with the bishop in regard to that. Generally speaking, our Anglican theology is that the Eucharist ought to be from the common celebration rather than from the reserved sacrament. We did have the special situation during Zoom church that people could take the sacrament home with them and receive while the church service, and so you still had a common event. So that's one of the aspects, but one of the elements that we do as we look at our understanding of why do we have, the term is orders in the church, the order of bishops, the order of priests, the order of deacons, the laity, the people of God. The aspect is that we celebrate according to our orders. And so part of that says that to have a true Eucharistic celebration, it would need to be in the presence of a priest that fully celebrate. Now, I've been with Roman communities where that's done differently. Of course, our priest was in jail at the time, but this was in the Yemen. He was toward the end of the Iraq. Well, I moved over there at the time when Iraqi hostages were released, but there were hostages in the Yemen at that time, and they picked up the Roman priest around that time. So there are different circumstances that can speak to this. But keep the question alive. The big thing will be to try to have good understanding. Why do we do the things we do? And some of that gets out of the scope of this and gets more into the aspect of having instructed Eucharists. Why do we do the things that we do?
Right.
And that's a good topic to raise later. Yes.
A question about your answer. You mentioned about the according to Anglican theology. But this is not an Anglican church. It's an Episcopal church. It's part of the Anglican community with different rules. Decidedly different rules, as you know. So the thing of it is, are you saying that this church will be Anglican, or are we distinctly Episcopalian?
Anglican in the sense of being part of the Anglican community.
Right.
But the folks who call themselves Anglican are not in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's a false term that they're using. So yes, I'm sorry for that confusion, but yes, we are the Episcopal branch of the American Episcopal Church. So there's also the Scottish Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church in the Philippines, but we are in communion with the Archbishop.
So we are still following the American Episcopal Church guidelines and rules and practices.
Right. But we are Anglicans in the aspect of being part of the worldwide Anglican, which is the overall understanding of how we do theology and how we approach.
You can appreciate given the past.
Oh, believe me, I was in San Joaquin for 10 years.
Yes. So, I agree, I wanted to ensure we have a distinction.
Oh, not to veer off the meaning, but we've all heard of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, is that part of the Episcopal Church?
No, that is the Methodist Episcopal Church, joined with another branch of Methodism to become the United Methodist Church.
Okay.
Which is seemingly about to become the Untied Methodist. They're undergoing a lot of problems right now. There is also the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is another branch. The term Episcopal refers to bishops. The Greek word episkopoi is an overseer. And so that refers to our aspect of having a structure with bishops.
Mm-hmm. So the Methodist Episcopal Church generally has nothing to do with the Episcopal Church.
Right, not at this time. They blended to become the United Methodist Church. There is a movement to have an understanding, a concordat, an accord, a treaty. I'm not sure which is the proper word these days, so that, like we have with the Lutherans, our clergy can go and function in their churches, and their church, the Lutheran clergy can function in the Episcopal Church. Eventually, we'll get to the point of doing that with the Methodists.
I see.
We're not there yet, main thing, I mean, aside from COVID delaying things,
Right.
we're waiting to see what kind of schism occurs in the Methodist Church. Who is it that we're going to be talking about?
Now, both the Lutherans and Methodists, like the Episcopal, have bishops.
Yes, but with different understanding of what that is and what their role, overall, what their role is.
Thank you.
So these have been some aspects of models of church leadership. Who's in charge? But it would come back to the aspect of who are you called to be?
Now, if we were to have a priest in charge for limited time, part-time work, now would we have to would they be on salary or?
That would be a lot of the negotiation that would have, generally speaking, that's what that would mean.
So then we would have to pay a portion of their, what is that, retirement?
Pension and so on, yes.
That's more than just their salary.
Right, so I mean, there are financial implications to all of these.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why I say a lot of churches have suddenly found themselves, boom.
Yeah.
And as I moved to San Joaquin and went to Oakhurst, there were 6 people in the congregation. And I got down to a few months later to also serve in Madera, and I think we had about 25. And then for my sins, which are many, Jerry Lamb sent me up to Atwater as well, where there were 6 people. It varies in terms of what's going on, but even in Madera, through people moving away and through death and so on, they were down to about 10 people by the time I left. So that's part of the struggling aspect in a lot of churches. So who are you called to be? And one of the aspects of raising this question is to say, how do we tell the bishop? How do we tell our own congregation? How do we tell the world that this is who we are? And how do we give a description of what we're doing?
How do we tell the community of Gridley also? We've had requests from the other deacons and other clergy in Gridley about, where are we going and what are we going to be?
Right.
How can we integrate with their mission work and stay with ours and so on?
That's part of how do we tell the world.
Right.
Is it becomes, as you can guess, perhaps, it gets into the aspect of mission statement. Or when we're at our best, this is who we are and how we operate. So one of the last things as we go through all of this will be an invitation to look at what do you have as mission statement. That may still serve you, or you may say, hey, it's time to have a different statement. The other thing that I really like comes from a priest colleague of mine, Eric Lowe, missional statements.
Say that again?
A missional statement. This is what we're doing. It's not sort of, in the name of Jesus Christ, we're going out, and try to use pious language. It's just sort of saying, we're feeding people. This is what's going on. And what I'd like to suggest, and this happens all over the place, the folks in Sutter Creek were terrified. Yeah, I think terrified is probably the right word, to call the bishop.
Oh.
They were just convinced the bishop was going to close them down.
Oh.
They were a failure. They couldn't afford things anymore. Death and people moving away and she said, no, I hear what you're doing. You're doing good things. You are the church in the county, and you are a voice for all these good things going on. You need to stay and just so supportive. If you know who you are and have an idea of how you're doing it, the bishop wants to support you. And will probably say, what can I do? May not have the funds that you would like, but we'll try to say, hey, we've got somebody over here who can help you with this. We've got somebody over here who can help you with this. So that's one of the aspects of being clear. When we're at our best, this is who we are. Bishop would love to hear that. People in town would love to hear that. Well, I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't. So, who are you called to be? Again, part of this you already know. We are all called to ministry through our baptism. Now, one of the challenges that I issue to y'all, and I may be stepping on toes here, so I don't know, I haven't been here long enough, but one of the big challenges in Nevada with total ministry is everything was focusing inward. We want to build booths and churches up on the mountaintop and just stay here. Most of ministry takes place in our daily workaday lives. That is ministry. Keeping the food production going is ministry. Tending the sick is ministry. Operating the shelter is ministry. All the different things that go on in our daily lives, and we complain about them because they're boring and this, and all the things that work on us, that is ministry nonetheless. Some of the work will take place to keep the church running. Some of the work may be done through special programs, which may be joint ministries with other congregations. But who are you called to be? How is that going to look? But one of the big things is trying to find a balance to keep the dailiness of our ministries going and to do the work at the church. And this is where it's very communistic, communalistic. If everybody in the church is spending 10 hours a week on things for the church, then perhaps that's all the priest needs to do because that gets the sermon ready. It means that somebody's going to visit the sick, and somebody's running the bulletin, and somebody's, all those different things. But we've got to find balance between maintaining the structures of our church life and our work in the world. There's much more to church life than this, but these were the 4 main points that I wanted to highlight. We keep the worship, keep the education. Fellowship is an important part, especially as we're coming out of COVID. People who are desperate. I heard from somebody in Sutter Creek said, somebody told me the other day they'd stopped coming to Trinity because we don't have coffee hour. Well, that person's going to the Lutheran church, which sits and looks at a screen to watch the worship going on in Lodi, but they have a coffee hour. So all of these are important points to consider and to find a balance. And administration has to have it. It's not nice, but...
What about outreach?
Well, that's part. This is the church life.
In general.
Right, in general. This is the aspect of the church life that has to balance out, and it feeds and nourishes us to do ministry in the world. So that's part of the point that I'm trying to make. This is to equip us so that when the deacon says, get up, get out, and go do it, you're ready to go do it. So this is the overview of what we're wanting to look at. And what I want to do is a brief introduction to the individual sessions to give you a sense of what some of those will be. One of the sessions will be based on a book called Holy Currencies. Eric Law, I think this was published in 2013. He has done a lot of church development, church organization, which he has blended with various aspects of diversity and understanding diversity and racism. And this is in some ways is one of the highlights of his work. I want to look at this because I think it gives a whole different set of different language than some of the other stuff I'm going to do, which is stuff that I was doing 30 and 40 years ago. So I think it's important to look at. We aren't going to delve into it, but I want to invite you all to look at it because some of the concepts, especially currency and stewardship, are important. The idea of currency flows. We need to keep the gifts flowing. We're used to thinking of money as a currency. But part of what Eric was doing is, these are just a couple of these things. Time and space are a currency. This building becomes a currency that you can share with others. And how is it being used? Relationships are currencies. Well-being is a currency. How can my well-being help with your well-being? Then we'll have another session on identifying gifts. And this ties back to stuff that I had done over 40 years ago. Went overseas, did a number of things, went into the monastery, came back. I went and did the course again. So after all of this stuff, who am I and where am I going? How are my gifts to be used? But then part of that was to help teach facilitate the course. How do we honor these gifts? How do we bring them together? Do we recognize them in ourselves and in each other? We'll have a session looking at some of the elements of what are the needs of community. How do we recognize them? How do we serve it? And this is stuff that I live 70 miles away. I don't know. I've got a good idea what some of the things would be. I worked with the homeless in Las Vegas. In fact, in some ways, that was my retirement plan. I worked with the homeless in Las Vegas so that I know where the resources were when I retired. And found all of a sudden, yeah, I'm an engineer, but now all of a sudden, I'm a social worker. I knew more than many of the social workers about where the resources were. So all of us have little pieces of this, and part of it's to have a conversation to do. And then part of it will also be to look at what are your passions and your abilities. And on an individual basis, that really makes sense. What are you passionate about? But when it comes to a collective, we'll have to explore that a little bit more. So Fred Buechner's comments, the place where God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Now, I do that up as more of a Trinitarian cycle here to the aspect, what are the gifts and talents are in one category. So that we've got our gifts and talents are sitting over here, and it's a wide array of things. The things that meet the needs of the world or the needs of a local community, they overlap, but there's a lot of gifts that I'm not meeting. There's a lot of gifts and talents that I have that aren't necessarily touching on the needs of the world or identifying at this point. And then there are the passions. And I think one of the biggest examples from my life, when I was at the monastery, I picked up bookkeeping. I can do bookkeeping. It meets some of the needs of the world. I've been employed as a bookkeeper, especially at a couple of churches. I'm not really passionate about the day in and the day out of bookkeeping. On the other hand, what I found working with those churches and other nonprofits that I've worked with, what I am passionate about and gets me into this sweet zone, if you will, is the fact that I can understand this is who you are. How can we express this? And so just about every place I've been, I've given them a new chart of accounts It says, this describes what you're doing and how you're doing it in a way that you can express it to the world. You can understand it, the world can understand it, and it actually meets 90% of what the CPAs want to see in terms of that. So I was passionate about setting that up, but the dailiness, thank you. Thank you, no. So we will be exploring a lot of that aspect. We will do a session. Now, at this point, I would say the things that I've covered so far, those will be my primary sessions where I'm got material to offer. Much of which is stuff that you will have already seen and already known in some way. We'll get discussion around it. A lot of it's stuff you can have a couple of weeks to have conversations and look at. But if at any point we start a session, you say, let's look at that again. Let's go into depth. Facilitate a conversation. Help us talk about it some more. We can do all of that. These next 3 sessions that I want to look at are going to be much more dynamic, asking a lot of questions of you to get some answers and some conversation and dialogue going. Probably won't be the answer, but we'll get a series of things going to sort of say, what's going on, how can we do it? As we look at the gifts and talents that are already here, what additional help is needed? Where can it come from? I think that's an important thing to look at. And it may be that the answer comes from the Methodist Church, or it may be that the answer comes from the diocese, or any of a number of things. One additional tool that I really highly recommend, get 2 or 3 people from the church to sign up as the fall comes for best skills, best practices. I think that the bishop's planning to offer that again. She helped develop that course when she was in Phoenix. It's through through Arizona State University Lodestar Center. And it's a quality course that offers essentially a certificate in nonprofit management. And they have other additional courses. So especially if you know younger folks who are still in their workaday career, this could be very helpful for wherever they're working. And to have a shingle that they could put out and have them in that sense. But they were very good skills. Because in the nonprofit world, we use language that's different than a lot of in the for-profit world. But even beyond that, on Friday nights as we met, folks at the Red Cross or folks who were working for some of the other I think one was at an art gallery. And so a lot of the skill sets that we done. The next morning, there was somebody who put that into church language. So this is what this would mean in this circumstance. Lots of good tools that help with the overall running of the church. That all of a sudden, here's a little thing, here's a little thing, here's a little thing, and combined, all of a sudden, we've got some skill set to make some good things happen within the church. So that's one that I want to flag and keep flagging for you. I've been doing nonprofit management for 30 years, and there's still some very good stuff for me in the midst of that. We'll get into a session to try to take a look and say, is it time to revisit what you have by way of mission statement? What are the uses of it? Now the challenge in many places that I've found, you got a mission statement. In a room this size, maybe one person can remember what it was, or half remember what it was. It's very helpful to go through the exercise to develop it, but a week later, nobody can remember what it is. And that's one reason why the missional statement can be a little more compact. But the other thing is, keep the mission statement in front of you. It's useful within your own congregation. stewardship. This is who we are, and this is why we need to get the funds coming in. Not to have just a bag of fun to meet a budget, but this is who we are and how we want to express ourselves. It can be very good for website and publicity, evangelism. This is who we are. Come visit us. Come be with us. I used to the one church I was at in Raleigh, that was, I think there were 500 or so on a Sunday, and you know, I used to joke and say, yeah, you got to come to us. We've got the best in utero choir in the whole country. You know, I think they had the adult choir, the high school choir, the junior high choir, the youth choir, and about 20 people who were pregnant at any given time. So, how do you advertise and make yourself known? I suggest one of the things that can be done as an organizing principle is to make use of that for vestry meetings. And at Trinity Center Group, we developed a new mission statement, which people knew wasn't the end-all and be-all, but it really came in. We provide a welcoming environment to explore our faith and serve others. That's what we came up, Zoom session that we came up with.
When we had bulletins, Paul, we had the mission statement printed on that, and it was more or less like you just said.
It keeps it in front of people, but it doesn't mean that they will remember. So we said as soon as we came up with it, put it on the website, put it, all the different communication, the newsletter, everything, we put it where people could see it. But I used it as an organizational structure at vestry meeting. So shortened in some aspect to say, here's the business part. We're going to be done with our business stuff because there's not that much business in a small church. We're going to do our business stuff in a half an hour. And then we're going to look at what is church community life this month. What's working, what's not. That's the welcoming environment and then to explore our faith got into the aspect of teaching and worship. How are we? Oh, we've got people who want to learn the Book of Common Prayer. Well, that's part of the aspect of it. So let's get that going. Who's going to teach it? When are we going to do it? Serve others, outreach, service to others. Those become organizing principles so that each time we got together, we'd have a little conversation. We wouldn't take any decisions necessarily, and oftentimes any decision we had did not need to have a vestry approval. It just, this is where the conversation would go on to say, what does this look like?
That's funny. I was just thinking the other day of adding a couple of categories onto our vestry agenda that would cover like outreach. What are people doing in outreach right now in the community? And that way I have a better record of what people were doing, and then adding like maybe the worship service, what was going on, and just so we could, I could be more informed, we could all be on the same page. So that's kind of what that.
You don't have to necessarily end the meeting to have that conversation, but essentially and I don't know about y'all, but my experience with the really small church vestry meetings is very much like when I was doing the engineering work in North Carolina. My boss traveled 100 miles or so to go to the small town of Belhaven, where the town council was going to have a vote to authorize $13 million to upgrade the sewage treatment plant. And he sat there, and for 45 minutes, the town council discussed Mrs. Jones' dog barking at 3 in the morning. And within 5 minutes, they approved spending $13 million.
It's Gridley, right?
I mean, that's part of our human nature. I mean, that's just somehow the way but if we pay attention to some of this and organize these meetings, we can change our culture in doing that.
I was just wondering how many of us remembered Mother Delia when she said, okay, we're gonna turn the vestry agenda upside down. First of all, we're gonna talk about what it is we wanna do, and then we're gonna talk about how we're gonna finance it.
Yeah,
Remember that?
yeah, so that's good.
And some of those types of things will show up, best skills, brass factors, there are lots. I think there's a whole category of books at the bookstore that can talk you into this. You know, mine's the best way, no, mine's the best way. You know, there's a variety of models. The thing is to go ahead and say, let's try something and let's do it for long enough that we can say, this is working or it's not working for it, but that we cover all the different topics that we need to. And then the final session, I've got it kind of as question marks here, but what are the discussions? Some of these things may happen organically that by the end of session 4, you've already got these answers. You know, I hope that we'll just keep those discussions going and keep the issues alive and say, what group discernment is needed? And what might that look like? How do we go through the process and have a specific day when we're going to do that? What's that going to look like? And part of that will then tie into how does that fit in with what's the wider church process? But part of that fits in with the other session. What outside gifts and talents do we need? And so that's the overview of what I've got in mind. Some good questions that you've already raised. Lots of stuff to go through. Most of which, like I say, I think you'll be familiar with a lot of it already, but it gives everybody in the room a common language. So one or two people who hadn't heard that before, okay, we can make all this happen. So, what other questions do you have?
So what's the next session going to be, Paul? Where do we go after this?
The next session that we will have will be the on holy currencies, based on the book. I will be giving a synopsis of the book and some of the concepts that are in it. There's a lot in there. I in some ways hesitated to add this because there's so much material that can be gleaned from it that I'm just going to scratch the surface, but I think it will give some good language, some good ideas that if something really catches somebody, all of a sudden now you've got a book study in your future.
Comment here. It seems to me that the whole process here is backwards. Basically going through to identify what people want and what their skills are and so on and so forth. And then we come down and decide who's going to be trained for what and be selected for what. But you haven't started out by saying what is needed. You know, the church is not building in that. And the church is not it. The church is out there. The church is the people here going out there to serve ministries. That's the church. That's the real church. That's the one I'm concerned about. Mm-hmm. And the question is what is needed? Before you start saying who's got what skills to train to do what is needed? And what can you do to meet that need? Okay, then start talking about where the resources to do that. You know, do you have the resources to do that? In St. Timothy was a total ministry church. This was a wonderful place. Basically, it had many wonderful ministries in the community. Basically, as the ministries were identified, we got together and basically figured out how to handle them. And it was really going very, very well until we started doing this process and trying to pigeonhole everybody, you know, and then focusing all the efforts on the building, golden book covers and stuff like that. And now, what are the ministries? I mean, what ministries are you practicing now? Going out there, I mean, not in here.
Mhm.
Okay? The ministries, I don't think are happening the way they used to. What are we doing for the homeless? I mean, not homeless, campfire homeless. Dozens and dozens of people which are camped out in the cold, in the wet, in the dark, right here in Gridley. How many, do we have any missions to, ministries to go down there and help them, find out what they need, how we're gonna help them?
You know what?
Okay, what about
Yeah.
the hungry? Are we continuing to still have the garden in the church? And where have all these ministries gone? That's what concerns me. Is what do you want to do? Because if you don't know what you're going to do, what's the point in selecting them?
Well, that's one of the things, all of these will fit together. That's where that Venn diagram, you know, the overlapping type of thing, we could start from any of those. I'm starting from the aspect of what are the gifts and talents, because part of that's to recognize there's a lot of needs out there in the community. I don't have the talent or the ability to do it. And so they're both needed, but there's enough material to do one session for each and trying to do them simultaneously. So we will be looking at, and what I will do during my sessions is to raise the question on how do we go about doing these. Part of your homework in the next 2 weeks will be to start identifying. And then the challenge will be, I talked about in terms of my passion in bookkeeping. The challenge is that my passions may not overlap with yours, and they won't overlap with Mary's, and they won't. And so now how do we have the conversation to say both, what are we willing to do? We may want to do a lot of stuff, but what are we willing to do? And then what do we have the resources to do? And part of that may be, how do we find the additional resources? That becomes part of the question, but that's a session all itself to try to explore how those end.
That's the point. Basically, you can go out there and try all kinds of things. What are the resources now? You can go out, not 4 months from now, but now, that you can apply in the community. You know, basically, what is the status of the finances of the church? They good?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they real good.
Yeah, they are.
And you used to have a really big ministry pile of money, okay? And which thanks to June and Bill Taylor. Okay? And then he had a small amount for building, you know. And you know, as long as you have the ministry money to do it, I think it needs to be in this economy be a focus as to what you do. But I think you've got to start from what you have available and what's there, and not essentially wait, you know, 4 months to think about it. Doesn't make any sense.
It'd be really great to have a conversation, including all members of the congregation. Many belong to service groups in the community, and those groups have identified needs in the community. The deacons, that's what deacons do is. We did a lot in helping people who were displaced by the wildfires. So we did a lot of research into, well, it just came upon us to know what a lot of those needs were. And then as we reached out as disaster chaplains, we learned I have a whole stack of resources of people who could come in here and use our meeting rooms to help people who still need help, who are displaced and who have moved to our community. Like there's a lot of emotional support that is still going to be needed by folks for another few years. And I have establish relationships with people who have training, who can come in and talk about developing resiliency, who can sit down in small groups and help folks who are struggling. And so one of the things we were doing before the COVID shut us all down was this room was a place where some of those groups were taking place. So we had to stop that.
Talk about NA and A.
Well, in addition to AA and NA, we had trauma recovery groups. So anyways, COVID put a crimp into some of the stuff we were doing.
What would be outreach to the people in the hotel over there, whether they're 13 or something that, we still, and
We supplement some of their needs.
And also, food is distributed here. I think they kind of set up in our cul-de-sac. And what agency is that? I haven't been involved.
Is it Northern? I've been here a couple of times when they did it. I'm not remembering the name. I can ask Lisa.
Community Action Agency, maybe? So they come in and with all their produce and food and canned goods and because it's kind of a shelter spot out there. I think they even use our pavilion.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. And so what we have is a gift of meeting places. We have a lot of manpower to do things, but we have this room and we have that room and we have the pavilion and we have a garden space. And so one of the things over the years that jumped out at me was that we have the opportunity to have a great ministry of hospitality to the community by inviting people in to use our meeting places for things that are needs. And then also to find out who else in the community can partner with meeting people's needs and how we can build people up to help them help themselves.
yeah, we also give to GERS too every year, so.
Yeah, and some, like Lydia goes over every year and translates from Spanish to English to facilitate that.
So we already have basically a fairly comprehensive list of ministries in place.
We actually, they're kind of quiet ministries because like none of us are young, strapping 20-somethings, you know.
I don't understand that.
But with
We're more
that
seasoned.
age comes some wisdom and some knowledge and skill that can be applied to various, a lot of teachers. You know, we have people who have become accomplished in their lives, counselors. And the thing they can bring is resources, to help provide this meeting place and some of the things that need to be, people need to be helped, you know.
But how do we know how many and where are these homeless people that need help? I didn't know that there was that many around.
I think we can check with the Lions Club. I could ask, because I know up until Herman leaving, the Lions Club does do a count. They actually go through every year and get a number.
Yeah, there's an agency that does that.
Yes.
It's on the point in time, it's every other year.
Yeah, point in time.
They just had it this week, and I'm sure that Butte County is keeping a record of that, so.
There's problems with it.
Each county does it.
Yeah, year before last when they did, they got a lot of reports from the homeless about being chased out of Gridley area, chased over to Orville, people wanting them to be reported in Orville so that they don't provide services here. And that was, I thought, was something which nobody seems to care about, but that was what was reported. And there's people all over this town in different places. You don't see them because they know that the community doesn't want them visible. And like the chief of police says, he goes out over down here, basically past Casey's down the apartments down there, the Casey's.
Yeah,
They,
they're down by the railroad track,
Yeah.
mostly camping.
And the cemetery.
Railroad
We
track
have the
they
camping.
go
cemetery.
past there, basically just
Skirts of town.
on the edge of town.
Well, what is their biggest need? Is it clothing or food, or do they want money?
I've often wanted to go and find out, but I physically cannot get there.
I don't think we really know.
Well,
But
that,
you know
that
what they-
becomes, that's one of the things that we'll touch on,
Mhm.
you know, in terms of how do you find these
How do
things.
you
Part of
find
it is,
them?
go and ask.
Yeah.
And everybody's gonna be different, everybody's in a different circumstance, in terms of, when you've got intact families, they are a different circumstance than the individual.
Right.
There's all kinds of reasons as to why they're there compared to what gets them out of the challenge. But a lot of it is to sort of say, okay, these are some of the things you want, but these are some of the things we can provide. And so we do what we can. At this point, it's not enough. Sometimes it's never enough,
Right.
but it's, in Oakhurst, one of the things that happened is they set up something. I was talking with somebody from the Presbyterian church. Oh, wow, this was so great. We had the groups over at our churches overnight during the winter, and so well, he got into recovery, and this one accepted Jesus, and this one did this, and I said, well, you're forgetting the most significant statistic. And he said, what? He said, nobody died on the street.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Most important.
everybody's got their own agenda going into these things, but sometimes we can lose sight of the big picture. What can we do to keep you alive? And sometimes just that food will keep you alive, but not much else. And sometimes just going that one next step, it's not enough, but it's better than nothing. And the next year you can do something more. So that's part of the aspect of doing this type of inventory and so on. There's lots of needs out there, some of which we can meet and some not. But let's go. What are the next steps?
Yeah, that point that, you know, they so feel that they're not welcome in town, that they stay over there, is always been a concern of mine because, you know, I had a friend that was homeless and he died, basically hiding in an abandoned house in town. I found a house right next to 7-Eleven down there that they, when they took it up, they found his body in there. I've been looking for him for 2 months. And,
Well, maybe we could be instrumental in organizing a homeless consortium, a group, you know, a round table of community members
I think that's
discussing issues. Like others were in Southern Utah, where that was part of what was at St. John's.
Does the city of Gridley itself do anything for them?
City of Gridley, the chief of police goes out there to check on them once a week.
Just checks on them.
Yeah, well, that's it. But, you know, basically there are a couple of things, you know, there's some good police officers among the crowd, you know. Some of
There
them.
was a community service officer
Yeah.
as well.
Well,
That's encouraging because
they do some things.
seen so many places where the last thing you want to do is see the police.
Yeah.
If you're in it, and some of the community policing means to look after the homeless who are victims themselves.
Yeah, there's some
Right.
pastors, I think, who, you know.
That's the key thing. Is they basically there are bathrooms available.
I know the Methodist Church has a little free food thing mounted on the side of their church. But the problem with that is that sometimes one person or two will go in there and clean it all out.
Right.
And it's you know, it's up to the community people that know about it to stock it. But if there was some other way to get the food spread out rather than have one person or two people take it and hoard it, you know.
I know St. John's Episcopal Marysville for a while, they used to have lunch
Yeah.
a couple of times a month there, and anyone was welcome to have lunch.
Once a week.
Yeah, I don't know whether they're doing it now, but
Yeah, they did.
And they had.
Now, they're one that is also
Closet as well.
a shorter priest as well, McMary'sville.
Yeah,
A lot of
I
stuff has
heard
gone
that.
by the wayside.
Well,
Yeah.
Paul's alternating down there.
Yeah.
I gave this talk to them last week.
Okay, great.
Yeah, they have
Yeah,
better.
the weeks I'm not with you, I'm in Marysville, and,
Oh, I see.
How many folks are in the congregation now or are attending?
right at the moment, there are about 16 on a given Sunday.
Okay.
Uh,
Not much bigger than us.
And the challenge every place, not just but this every place in terms of using the pandemic as an excuse. I'm really not keen on church. This is the excuse to drop out. And how many people will in fact come back? It's going to take a while to find out. And in some ways, I realize tight-knit communities, you know people, and some people, well, we want you here. You started coming in 1920, and you're still a member. Well, no, you haven't been here for 10 years. No, you're not a member. And so that becomes part of the challenge. Yes, that you've got the history with this, but in terms of this is who we are now, you kind of got to go with the folks that are in the room. That's painful sometimes, that people who have been with you aren't necessarily on board with what you're doing, but you've got to keep going. But part of the aspect of knowing who you are, that becomes attractive to other people as well. These people may say, no, I'm not with you, but other people may suddenly say, hey, I like that, I'm coming. Well, I'm going to leave it there for today.
Thank you, Paul.
Keep the conversation going.
Sure.
I mean, I not a huge amount to give you homework in that sense, but keep the conversation going. And you know some of the topics that are coming up, so be prepared with some of the things as we touch them. We may end up going like I was saying, sometimes people go to the last page of the handout and start asking for things. We may jump ahead on some. I'd like to sort of unfold some of the presentation so everybody knows the same thing, but then these are important questions to keep alive. So, and I do have a summary slides, if you will, of everything. So anybody who wants this, you can do a photocopy of the items. Of the slide. I didn't print it with the picture in the background, but figured that would use up too much ink.
That might be really helpful for folks who are able to be here today.
I just wanted to say one thing. We went to a convocation, and I think, Patrick, you were there. We went to Yuba City years ago to a convocation. And I remember hearing Willows. They said they had to change their perspective because they kept telling themselves, we are so small, we really can't do anything. And they changed it to say, as small as we are, what can we do?
Yes.
And it said the door just flew open.
Well, that's the way it's been with St. Timothy's through the years. In the early years, we didn't know if we were going to be able to pay our electric bill from year and gas bill from year month to month. But we took what we had and was able to use it, and then things got better.
And then we stopped beating ourselves up because we didn't have young people here.
That's right, Mary.
We stopped beating ourselves up over that. And we certainly accept and invite young people to come and educate them when they come, but we realize maybe we're in a different part of the life cycle.
Absolutely.
And we have this facility that we could offer. And I think St. John's, when I was there, was in that same situation. They had maybe 30 some that were coming to church, and they had this wonderful, perfect facility for community outreach, which they were doing a lot of, but the community outreach was bigger than they were. And they were at that point having financial concerns about all the maintenance that, offer hospitality, it does take a commitment maintenance, to do a little extra maintenance, and that was becoming difficult.
Liz, what kind of ministries were you involved in when you were up on the ridge?
Actually, I was up on the ridge, but I was going to Chico.
Oh, you were?
I came to Northern California in 1974, and that was an exciting time too. You recall there were 2 Episcopal churches in Chico, and I was on the vestry that had to decide which one we were going to keep. And the one downtown, of course, was the most visible, and it was historic, and it was, you name it, it had a lot going for it. The other one had 7 acres.
Yeah.
It was an almond orchard that they had built this small church in. And what they had kind of decided to do was they took the 7 acres with a smaller church, and they had all their Sunday school program out there. So they drew all the young people. Well, then downtown, they had all the older people, and their service was at 11 o'clock. And they had all these seniors in there. Well, what happens to seniors? So, and the ones that were coming up in Floral with the younger people, they stayed at Floral. So the one downtown pretty much died. And it was sold. God forbid, it was made into a Chinese restaurant. And that ended up in catastrophe. And eventually, a group of them from the original St. John's bought it back. And it started, but they didn't have the Episcopal church, they had the Anglican church in there. And so we've kind of avoided it. Those of us who are loyal to St. John. And the Sunday school at that time was amazing. I taught Sunday school for a long time. And then I took on a youth group, had that for a while. Sang in the choir sometimes. I did various jobs. And most recently I was on the Altar Guild. And then of course COVID shut that down because we couldn't have services at the church. So now it's starting to come back some. But I was involved in a good deal of it in Chico, but not up on the ridge. I was really kind of put off because, for one thing, they had pulled down, well, they built the new church up there, but they had a screen that pulled down out of the ceiling that covered the altar, covered the altars. And then they projected the words and so on that screen. I'm very happy to notice you have it on the side. That's a much more acceptable thing for me. I don't want to cover the altar.
No.
That was very, they also quit having live flowers.
Oh, really?
They had paper flowers, whatever they were. Anyway, that put me off. So there were things like that I didn't feel comfortable with. So I chose, and of course I had lots of friends at Floral Avenue. And they have done some amazing things down there. Recently, they, with 7 acres, you have a lot of opportunity. And they put in a big garden back there with Jesus Center. And they're now growing their own fruits and vegetables back there that they are using at the Jesus Center. They feed the poor with the food that they're growing there. They're supporting a Boy Scouts troop number 3, and the boys are getting their Eagle badge by doing
Nice.
wonderful things. If you haven't been up there, just go and walk the property. It's amazing. They've got, they're like flower boxes only meant for vegetables all around the old parking lot. And that the boys have built for an Eagle project. They put in a wonderful prayer garden as a Eagle Scout project. There are several things out there that they've done.
We should go.
It's an amazing thing to see, and I know Father Richard would be proud to show you. If you give me a call and let him know you come in, all of the things that have been going on up there. And he has personally, he and another gentleman that is a member of the church have actually gone out and walked the town at night.
Yeah.
To serve
Yeah.
the people on the street. And we brought personal items like toothpaste and toothbrushes and mouthwash and what have you, and they would hand those out. We brought socks. We brought in, just to go buy a dozen socks, big deal. But if several people do that, then there's a lot of people on the street that have no socks.
Right.
Number 1 requested item.
The socks.
Socks, and they bring, and so we brought socks as our gift. And at the back of the church, we put a basket, and when we came in, if you had something to put in the basket, it was there. And at the time they brought up the offering, they would have some of the children at church bring up the basket with the other offerings. And so that was quite good. So, I don't know what else to say.
Is Mother Delia still in Chico?
Pardon me?
Mother Delia still in Chico?
Other Delia.
No, Delia is at Paradise.
She's in
She's
Paradise.
in Paradise.
She's been in church in Paradise now.
She's, I think, Father Yale is sort of overseeing Paradise in addition to Chico, and she is working with him, I think.
Yeah, he has done a great deal with the people from it. I was, actually myself, I was in Regalia.
One of the coolest decisions she ever made here was somebody reported. There was a show shed out here, right over there. And somebody, homeless, broke in there and stayed in there. And said, well, we're gonna go get a padlock and all that. I said, no. Take the latch off, please, over.
We had someone also living in the hedge for a short period of time.
Yeah,
So we
same
discovered
person.
them, and then they were no longer private. So.
Well, at any rate, we're glad you're with us, Liz.
Well, thank you.
Now you're moving your membership from
I have.
here to here?
I have. I talked to Father Richard yesterday, that actually, my daughter has lived here for many years, and so they were quite adamant that my house did not burn. I was fortunate. It was right at the end of the street, and the fire came up that street, all the way, and so the street curved, and it goes, you come in this way, and then it went out that way. And this part up here did not burn, the part down here did. And so I was lucky. But I was still lucky because I was able to sell it for a nice profit. But on the other hand, I had to leave a lot of my things behind because I had no place to put them. At that time, I was taking care of my sister who was dying of cancer in Arizona. And so where do you put a whole house full of furniture? And so I had to leave a lot of it behind. And yard tools and things of that nature. I had left them behind because I didn't have any place to store them or to keep them. So, then after Mary passed away, Carolyn very insistently wanted me to move back to where she lives, which is in Gridley. And so I found a place up here on Spruce and was able to get it.
Well, we're glad you did.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
The money I got from my other place paid for it, so I'm fortunate that I have no mortgage.
Paul, do you have
All right.
any reading you want us to do? Do you want us to read some of the, or just follow along with what we're gonna do here?
I'd say following along is fine. If you all want to get hold of holy currencies even before we start, or just wait until you hear the summary and then decide whether it's something you want to pursue this
That
time,
sounds good.
Yeah, that'd be good.
I think would be the better course. And there are people, I know Father Ray Hess was trained with the Kaleidoscope Institute and knows other trainers in Sacramento. I've done a lot of work with them, but not all the way through to become a trainer, a facilitator for things. But there are facilitators close at hand who can guide deeper into some of the things raised from there. But see what it seems like. It may be that just a book study would be enough, or that the other materials would keep you busy enough that you don't need to look at holy currencies until all of a sudden a year later somebody says, oh, what about, So I'm just trying to stir the pot in some ways to get the creative juices going and eventually start honing in and saying, here's what we want to be during this next year. And we need to do this, this, and this as next steps.
Now, you will be here not next Sunday, but the following Sunday.
That's correct.
It will be session number 2.
Exactly.
So pass the word on, put it on your schedule.
So, there was some discussion about maybe having, a discussion on the weeks that you're not here with us, to pursue and share questions we might have had on the discussion when you were here in the presentation. So do you have suggestions about how that might work?
I think just like an open forum.
I think open aspect, see what comes up. At one level, the more organic it is, to be a coffee hour and say, oh, do you remember what did you think from last week?
Right.
On the other hand, I think you were talking about trying to do some sort of session on the weeks that I was here for Lent. So
actually, it makes sense to do the Lenten studies on Fridays.
okay.
And then do the open discussions on Sundays.
I think that would
Might
make
be
sense.
asking,
Is sort of
I
chew
agree
on
with
it
that.
during the week and then
Right.
what did you think? What about and come up with what was it on Click and Clack? Have the stump the chump session. And as I start the next session, what about? But if there's any event that raises enough questions to say we want to have a facilitated discussion, we want to enter more quickly. I can try to facilitate. That means we just sort of put off for another way. It extends things, which may seem like, oh, we're trying to get done. We want to be done by a certain time, but I'd like to suggest that transition needs to take what it's going to take.
And this, actually, the theme of this is letting go, which I think kind of dovetails with our whole discussion here. So it might be interesting to see how the two work together. So I have these booklets.
We could bring up some of those things, like you said, after if you're gonna have soup or whatever, rather than a particular study of the gospel, whatever, if we had some questions about this, and then we could go to the gospel study. My only thought is if you heap too much on on the 10 of us, you go, okay, well, you have to stay after church, and then you have to come on Friday,
Well, you
and then
don't.
you're gonna have another.
That's totally optional.
Well, I agree, I know, but.
And then again, for those who aren't here, you know, let them know, keep the invitations going, keep them in the conversations. I know one book I was reading on missional activities took place in Tanzania, and the priest was talking about he would go from village to village, and one day a week, and he'd be doing essentially a catechism, he'd be teaching. They'd never heard stuff going on. And when it came time later to say, do you all want to be baptized? You know, and they said, well, yeah, we do. And well, these people didn't come to class. And they said, we had 6 days to talk about this. We taught them what you taught us. They want to be baptized, you know.
Right.
And
Yeah.
he had just sort of, you got to be in the room. No, everybody's involved. So keep the voices alive. More people come and go. But keep the conversation among yourselves. That's going to be the big thing. And